Hello, and welcome to the workshop Demystifying Grant Writing. My name's Clarabelle Gross, and I'm one of the midwives, one of the core members. Also on the Zoom today is Emily, one of the midwives core members, and this is our first official practical skills workshop. If you don't know what the midwives are, we're a small artistic collective. We believe in the creative in everyone, and we're open to anyone and everyone. We currently will be opening up a term again, have a lot of information on the website. If you're interested in the midwives, you can look us up, themidwives.org, or you can, send an email to me, info@themidwives, and I'll give you more information. We have with us today Eva Rogers, who was kind enough to facilitate Demystifying Grant Writing. Go ahead and ask. This is our series that we want to get off the ground, Practical Skills for Artists. And I wanted to say, if you have any questions along the way, I'll be monitoring the chat. Also, feel free to raise your hand. Eva's here on the screen and can hear you as well. Well, with all that being said, welcome. It's nice to see everybody, and I'm going to pass it off to Eva.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Clarabelle. Thank you, Emily. Thanks to the midwives. Welcome, everyone, to the workshop. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks to the midwives for suggesting this series of practical skills workshops and for having me here to talk about grant writing. I will say a little bit of an intro to myself. I'm a writer, and I was a member of the midwives in term 5, which was September of last year, 2022, through May of this year, and really just loved the framework for support that they offer, loved the structure of having a midwife and being a midwife and learning about other people's creative projects and processes. And I also really loved the circle gatherings. So just thanks so much to the midwives for everything you do. My background and interests are in writing and art. And coming out of college, I was struck with the need to find a job and was figuring out what one does with an English major. I went to undergrad at the University of Michigan, and then after that, I moved to Tucson and sort of kicked off my professional life there. I was there for a few years. I moved to San Francisco and spent about a decade there. And then I moved to Minneapolis and was there for a handful of years. And now I'm kind of in various places. I'm currently physically in San Francisco at the moment, doing a little bit of apartment sitting. As far as this work, the work of sort of grant writing and fundraising, I started this pretty quickly coming out of college, working with the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tucson as a volunteer grant writer while they were a fairly young museum and kind of building capacity. And then eventually I was sort of working in parallel with a paying job working in marketing. But after that, I have since worked in organizations with nonprofit organizations in the arts and in education and civic tech. And have recently served as a founding board member of a group called Fireweed Community Woodshop in Minneapolis, previously known as the Women's Woodshop, and was founded by the artist and woodworker Jess Hirsch in 2017. And there I helped the group get its first grants and collaborated with the rest of the founding board to kind of guide it through the process of becoming a nonprofit. And I do this work generally now, the work of grant writing and fundraising, in a kind of freelance or consultant capacity. And I have enjoyed this work over the years because for me, it really kind of brings together the creative side of my brain, and it is extremely practical. You're working to tell a compelling story about your creative work or any project or kind of organization you're working with, and you're working within a series of constraints to kind of communicate effectively. So I've been doing this work now for coming up on 20 years, supporting artists and creative projects in their process of growing, and now have been kind of working on the process of turning to finally seek support for some of my own writing projects. So I've been looking at things like attending residencies and have applied to a couple. So some of that is also like on my mind in terms of how I'm framing things. So topics we will cover here, just some bullets. We'll talk about kind of research and alignment between your project and what a funder is aiming to fund, thinking about communicating your why and how you make your case for support. We'll talk a little bit about project budgets and figuring out how much money to ask. Talking a bit about timelines and deadlines, generally the application process, what you do when you get a grant, or if you don't get a grant this time. And then I'll share a bunch of just kind of resources and links that you'll be able to access later. And also, I will just say that I tried to cram everything I know into this presentation, which is a little bit of a classic grant writing dilemma, the desire to just sort of stuff it full, overstuffing the burrito. I will say the key to your own success when seeking funding will be about knowing your audience and knowing who you're writing for and who you're writing to and kind of what the connection is there. So this presentation generally has a little bit of everything, but I hope it will give you a good overview. And as noted, there will be a recording. I'm happy to share the slides and you can ask questions. Yeah, so I also have a few framing thoughts, which I hope will kind of give you a shape to kind of hang some information on, sort of like a framework. I have a number of framing thoughts. I tried not to put too many up front. And I also was remembering a time that I have developed a proposal for a colleague who kept asking me to sort of put everything at the top, like the good ideas. She was like, bring this up earlier, like bring it up to the top. But if you put everything at the top, then you're basically right back where you started with kind of a long document where, because everything can't live at the top. So bear with me through some of my framing thoughts. I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that grant seeking is a competitive process, but at the same time, you know, I think it's possible to be both collaborative and competitive. You know, there can be this sense that you're sort of competing with other people or organizations or projects for sort of limited funds. But I also feel like in the world of fundraising and seeking funding, you're something that's a good fit for the work you're doing or the project you're trying to fund. And others are also kind of doing the same sort of thing, looking for like a resonant kind of alignment. So some things are going to be a fit, some things aren't going to be a fit, but I just think the process of sort of sharing information rather than kind of finding things and holding them close to your chest, I just sort of believe in that sort of a more sharing approach. And just generally, part of the reason we are here talking about grants and trying to, you know, access money in this way is the fact that, you know, fundraising exists because wealth is unevenly distributed. We've got folks who are dramatically rich, and we've got things like, you know, social service projects, creative groups, creative folks generally kind of working hard to access not necessarily giant quantities of money. But if wealth was more evenly distributed, we might see money in more of the places where it kind of needs to be. And I think just generally that the landscape of nonprofit work and creative practice would be different. But just to say, like, the system is, you know, sort of complicated and messed up in some ways. But so while we're working within that, you know, working within the system, I also think it's important to just be supportive of other folks, be supportive of our peers who are also kind of working in this system. And then also just in the context of competition, contexts when you're seeking funding can be different, kind of depending on the nature of a funding source. Sometimes things like your government funding or like local and regional arts councils or city, you know, funding opportunities, they may have kind of a pool of money that they want to give to as many people as possible, as long as you're kind of meeting certain qualifications. So sometimes you'll have situations where folks are giving out a limited number of grants for kind of specific dollar amounts. Other times there's kind of a big pool of money that is available to be accessed. And we'll talk a little more about project budgets a little later in the conversation. But, you know, generally you're wanting to think about coming in to ask for the funds you need, that also is operating in the context of how much funding is being given out and that sort of thing. Just generally, you won't get every grant you apply for, but it's important, I think, you know, think about taking the process seriously, but also kind of holding it lightly. Don't feel down if you don't get one. You'll get one some other time. There are, you know, some people you're going to get some of the time, you won't get every single one, but don't take that as any sort of like judgment on the work that you're doing. Generally, just as we're moving through, I think it would be great if you have a project you're working on or your own sort of creative practice, or maybe there's kind of an organization you work with or some sort of project, you know, turning into an organization, have something, you know, kind of hold in your mind a bit, this sort of internal sense of understanding what you might be kind of fundraising for, which you'll want to have in mind as you're sort of researching and investigating funding opportunities. And pairing with that, the sort of external sense of you want to start to gain an understanding of what the scope of what any funder is kind of seeking to fund. So you have your internal sense of what you're seeking money for. You start to develop an external sense of what a funder wants to fund. And you will see with different funders that you have different tools and kind of containers and materials that they might be requesting through which you can tell your story. So this might be something, sometimes someone might just want some narrative and a budget. So you have words and numbers to tell your story. They may want, other kinds of supporting attachments, like, do you have images of your work? Do you have press or any sort of like coverage of your work out in the public? Do you have letters of support or kind of testimonials? So just various things. You'll start to get kind of a handle on what are the tools at your disposal to tell your story. I also like to think about the process of applying for funding as you're kind of building a bridge between what you want and need funded and what any grant maker is wanting and needing to fund. So you have goals, you have a plan, you have expertise in something, you have a unique approach to something, you know how to create some kind of impact or outcome. And the thing you need is money. You need money to cover your expenses. And funders have money, and they also have their own kind of sets of goals that they're trying to achieve variously. And they have the money, and they would like to apply that money to achieve those goals. So ideally, you're kind of meeting somewhere, and you're making that connection between what you're trying to do and what they're trying to fund as well. And you're kind of telling the story in part of how, you're telling the story of your work or any project, and you're also telling the story of how the money will help you achieve something tangible, like money, it will be transformed or kind of translated into some kind of impact in the world. I wanted to note that you will kind of start to get a sense for some things that are like a little harder to fundraise for, some that are a little easier to fundraise for. And it doesn't necessarily mean that anything that's harder to fundraise for is not of value, just that there can sometimes be these sort of like mainstream approaches that maybe are not quite at the edge where you may be working, though you may also run into some funders who are kind of, it's great to see, are working at the edges themselves and sort of pushing the funding field forward. And this could mean maybe if you're doing something kind of experimental, or it's the first time that you're doing something, or, the first time doing a new thing that's kind of building on your past work, or if just kind of your outcomes are a little uncertain, it might be a little harder to seek funding for that. But you can often, maybe there's a way that you can kind of think about like nestling the new thing in a way that builds on, maybe there are some things you've accomplished along the way that then you can say, I want to step into this experimental territory, and people might be kind of more willing to join you on that journey. So that's just something to keep in mind. Again, it's not any sort of like value judgment on anything you're doing, just, the nature of the field of philanthropy kind of has its shapes as well. Great. And I wanted to say time. I want to talk about time. Time, one of the most essential ingredients in developing a strong and competitive proposal for anything. Really, you're going to want to reserve time to kind of shape and revise any narrative around the work you're seeking to fund. Maybe you're working with collaborators, and you're going to want time to gather information from them and work on the kind of collaborative development of all the elements of your proposal. And this would be internal or external. Like if you're a person seeking funding for a project and you have collaborators, that's that space. If you may be working kind of within an organization or a project that way, you might have program staff or finance staff or just variously folks you're working with. And in all cases, you might be, maybe you're seeking letters of support or recommendation, or you kind of need to round up images. Like you're going to need time for those things. And as you're putting together a proposal, you're going to want to have time to just review it all together so you all understand how you're positioning, what you're asking for, and essentially kind of what you're promising that you'll be doing. And also, depending on the nature of your work, you may want to make sure you're reserving time to engage community in kind of reviewing what you're proposing or being a part of the process of kind of developing a project. And leaving time there to solicit feedback and be able to actually integrate that into the proposal. I feel like sometimes just the concept of like building in time can feel a little bit contrary to things in the world. And I feel like I've worked on enough tight timelines myself to just know that it is up, it's something I'm aspiring to always build in time, even though sometimes there's not as much time as I might wish. But I think it's good for all of us to kind of give these processes the time they deserve to unfold in the best possible way. And I started thinking about this as I was putting together this proposal or this presentation, that I started thinking about it as kind of horizontal time rather than vertical time, because I spend a lot of time with my Google Calendar. So I was thinking about like the days in the Google Calendar kind of being like vertical time, like 8 hours in a day is vertical. So like you could imagine spending, let's say you're somehow going to spend 20 hours or 40 hours on a proposal in this whole kind of process. You could imagine like doing it in a really dense week, which would be like 40 hours of vertical time. But like also imagine if you were working on it over 6 weeks or like a month or two, and building in time for all these kind of different parts of the process over time. And then you also have time to kind of digest the work as you're going, digest how you're communicating it, digest it with your collaborators. So just thinking about kind of baking in time over a period of time rather than, kind of hitting it a few days before the deadline and you're trying to squeeze a bunch into a short period of time. Also on the topic of time, generally I was thinking about, coming out of the pandemic, also as I'm getting a little older myself, I don't have the energy to grind on things that I used to. Like maybe I used to work late and work on super tight deadlines. And I would say generally I feel over that vibe. And since I don't really want to do that, I'm also assuming other people don't want to kind of grind at the same time. So working on a project where you're going to involve other people, you're building in time so that nobody's grinding. So, this could look different. Some of it is reflecting on the parts that maybe are going to take you more time, or maybe you are kind of stressful to you. So it's good to start early. Like maybe the act of writing stresses you out. So maybe you start early where you're kind of just like, gathering bullets, or you're kind of collecting information and kind of language that might already exist for you. Maybe you want to start reaching out to your collaborators sooner rather than later. Maybe if it's stressful to you to think about numbers and how to start putting together a budget for a project, you might just make a spreadsheet, start putting some ideas in. If you're building some sort of project where you're going to travel, you're like, I'm going somewhere, there's going to be a plane ticket associated. Okay, that's part of the budget. Are we going to pay our collaborators, a stipend of X amount of dollars? So you can kind of start building things and start putting words on the page, putting numbers into your spreadsheet, and it starts to just make it feel a little more tangible. And also just generally, the more people who are involved in the process with you, the longer time it's going to take to prepare a successful application. So just generally time, everyone's going to want and need it, and try to build in as much as you can. Also, I think this is maybe the last of my framing thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this pre-journey. Generally in this proposal, I will say, I keep calling it a proposal, presentation, and it's a proposal to you about the things you will propose. Sometimes I think grant writing and the process of kind of putting together requests like this is a little bit about moving in and out of the weeds. Like sometimes you're really kind of deep in the details, and then you just have to remind yourself to like pop out, get a view of the whole landscape. You're going to have multiple pieces, multiple people involved in a process. So think about kind of being in the weeds some of the time, popping out, looking at the big picture, and just kind of zooming in and zooming out, and having the process go both ways kind of throughout for you. Okay, so I wanted to say that grants are one kind of money that you might be seeking for your work. And there are other opportunities and ways to access money. Grant funding occupies this kind of general space where it can be slower and it can be a little more laborious. You're going to put together a whole application. And depending on the nature of the funding opportunity, the turnaround time, it may be something in the realm of like 4 months, 6 months, it could be longer. But sometimes, it can also have a high dollar amount attached or some, form of recognition that's valuable. So you're operating on this longer time scale, but maybe there's a bit more of a reward potentially. And depending, if you're working with an organization, there might be, or, a project of any kind, the grant funding can be a great and sort of reliable way to start to increase funding for your program or project beyond kind of the initial earned income strategies you might have. I think grants can kind of fit into this space where you're aiming to sort of level something up, to the next level, or maybe you're ready to grow into the next stage of something, but you kind of need a chunk of money to help you kind of get up to that next level. There are other forms of funding, which we won't go deep into just all kinds of fundraising, but other kinds of funding that can be quicker, things like individual support. Maybe there are like crowd fundraising kind of opportunities, or individual folks in your networks who you might be able to ask for money. If you're an organization or a project, you might be able to have kind of membership support that way, or maybe you are doing things like offering classes or services, so you're kind of earning income that way. Maybe you're putting on events to earn income. So there are other ways of getting money that are maybe a little faster. Just generally noting that grant seeking is not necessarily the fastest way to earn money. And as we've established, it's also competitive. So there are ways in which it can be hard to rely on the dollars that way. But it also can be a good way to access a chunk of funding to kind of level something up at what can be kind of a critical time for the project. So talking a little bit about research and funder alignment. I wanted to talk a little about figuring out like who's giving money and how to find them. One of the ways, there are kind of tools and services and databases out there that you can access that sometimes have costs associated, but there are also just easy ways to start kind of poking around. If you are working with an organization or project and other kind of orgs and projects who are similar, you can start just like seeing who's supporting folks in the landscape where you're working. This might be things like if someone's putting on a project or an exhibition or something like that, there might be kind of credit lines that they're sharing. They might have, organizationally, there might be things like annual reports or donor thank you pages. There are places where people are saying like, this is who's giving us money. Thank you to those people. And then sort of in parallel on the individual side of things, depending on the type of work you're doing, you might essentially kind of be reading people's bios and resumes, like see where people are publishing, see if they've won, awards or grants. Folks who are kind of operating in the same space, you can start to kind of pick up on the names of things that the places people are going to access funding and places that are giving out money. And as I mentioned, there are databases where you can kind of do some research. There are things like the Foundation Center, which kind of has gotten folded into something called Candid now, and a database called Instrumental. And a lot of these are kind of paid services. And I'll talk a little more. I think, some of them are kind of providing kind of additional information that helps give you some clues about how to seek funding. Also, sometimes they're just kind of combing what is publicly available information. So, if there might be ways that you can find someone whose organization subscribed to one of those things and see if you can kind of poke around in there a little bit. I also, depending on your relationship to email, you can subscribe to a million emails. My own email is a little bit of a wasteland, so I subscribe to everything and just sort of skim and dump. But things like Philanthropy News Digest, which is a product of Candid and Foundation Center, you can select your criteria, get some emails that way about requests for proposals. I like this. There are some emails called eFlux. They're like Art World emails. They send about 1 million. But I also have seen kind of residencies, grant opportunities bubble up that way. And then there are like institutions that are sort of like hub institutions, like the Artist Communities Alliance is a place that's kind of aggregating residencies all over the country and beyond. An organization like Creative Capital, which has its own funding, like grant funding program, but they also aggregate resources for folks and share them on an email. And I was thinking about the art newsletter Hyperallergic, which does a similar sort of opportunities newsletter. And I have links to some of these resources that I'll share, so you can access them and sign up if you like. Join me. I mean, I'm sure everybody's email is a little bit of a wasteland, but and you will also, I think it's also a great opportunity to check out who is funding in your state, in your county, and in your city. There are funders who are funding in the places where they have lived, or maybe they've had business locations there, or maybe they have some sort of family history tied to a place. And then there are funders who kind of fund specific causes, and then funders who maybe fund all kinds of things, but in specific places. There are kind of these different just formats of how people with money are deciding what causes and kind of where they're giving that money. So there are opportunities for you to just kind of, you could be searching for, criteria that sort of applies to the type of work you're doing, the spaces in which you're operating, the place where you live, the place where you're going to be doing the work. There are just a lot of ways you can kind of start just searching around for different kind of funding opportunities that way as well. And generally, I will say, you will be well positioned if you are reading the information that funders and awarding agencies are providing. This might be a website. They might have provided a detailed sort of notice of funding opportunity, other kind of forms of guidelines. This feels very obvious, but also is pretty critical. If they're taking the time to kind of put together information about what they're seeking to fund, like they're straightforwardly telling you what they're trying to do, they'll tell you what they're looking for, and they'll ask you questions about what you're doing. And basically you want to pay attention to what they're saying about what they're funding, and pay attention to the actual questions they're asking as you're answering. Because I'll also say generally, like as you do this kind of thing, and as you're kind of assembling material about your work and your projects, you might think like, okay, I've already written one, I'm going to like copy and paste it into this other one. And that will definitely like get you some of the way. But just also the kind of obvious statement of like, if they're asking questions, am I answering the questions that they're asking? So that's just a thing to keep in mind. And also there may be opportunities where if you have additional questions, you can reach out to a program officer or someone at a funding institution of any kind. I would just generally say, I love that act of asking questions, but I personally hate to ask questions that have already been answered for me somewhere. So again, it's just a reminder to kind of be thorough about your research and then kind of dive in with your questions after that. I'll also say sometimes, depending on the nature of whatever kind of funding institution, some funders will offer opportunities to actually review your proposal in advance. And if that ever comes your way, I would say take advantage of that, because essentially it's just a great opportunity to start the conversation, see if there's direct feedback from the folks who are either going to be reviewing your proposal or sort of facilitating the review by kind of passing it along to other folks who will be reviewing. So if that happens, I say go for it. Generally, as you're researching and determining funding opportunities, you'll also kind of just be evaluating what you're seeing along the way. You want to have a clear understanding of your own goals. You want to be able to understand their goals and where those two sets of goals are intersecting. You might ask yourself if you might hear about a grant opportunity and then start to think about whether you're somehow being asked, or you're going to have to ask yourself to kind of stretch too far to request certain types of funding. I think it's important to just keep this in mind, because sometimes you can see that funding is available and it might have a big dollar amount and you're like, I want that money. You know what I mean? But you want to think about, is it asking you to sort of take your work in some direction that's not actually where you want to go with your work? And you're like, because you're going to, if you get certain kinds of grants are going to have kind of parameters associated where if you've said you're going to do certain things, then at the end, they're going to say, did you do those things? So, ask yourself if you want to be doing those things, ask for that money. There are also funding opportunities out there that are a little less kind of strings attached and more for you to go and take your work in any direction. So keep your eyes peeled for those, but also kind of think about what you're promising you're going to do as you're putting together applications. And I also think it's handy to, as you're researching and coming across opportunities, decide what kind of your thresholds for time and investment in an application are, because there are some that are going to be more work than others. I think most folks are generally operating in the digital space of the internet these days, but I occasionally come across folks who are still looking for paper applications, and have even recently come across a funder who was looking for 10 copies of a full application in paper. And I think it's worth, if you come up against that, asking yourself, are these funders being respectful of my time and the environment with their application process? That's just something generally to keep in mind. But overall, you're kind of trying to get to the space where you're distilling what a funder is looking for, and you're seeing if it's aligned with what you're doing. Are you operating in the same space together? And you don't want to be kind of overreaching or painting some sort of picture of possibility that you don't actually want to be following through on. Like, make sure you're seeking funding for the things you want to be doing. I don't know if this applies to other folks, but I would say sometimes there can be a desire. You can get into a little space where you're like, I want to win this grant. But, just the sort of competitive space. But if you win the grant, but you somehow don't actually want to be doing the work you've committed to, then that's not actually a win. So, and also, if you're doing this kind of work with an organization or a project and you see a funding opportunity, there can kind of be this way sometimes that funding opportunities are sort of like a leading indicator, as in, like, it can help spark ideas for what you might think you do want to be doing. You might come across this kind of moment of like, oh, this funding opportunity for this project is kind of like in the space where we were thinking about going, so it's an opportunity to say, like, is this something we at our organization or at our project, or, yourself on your own time, is this something I was actually planning on doing in some form? If it's going to help kind of nudge you into the place where you want to be, then that is a good thing. But again, you don't want to just be chasing funding for the sake of getting money, even though we all also need money. So yeah. Talking a bit about priorities and how you frame up why you are seeking funding. Just at a baseline, the fact that you need money is not a case for like why you need money, even though that's very real. But you will be kind of working on establishing your why you're doing this work, why you're doing this project. I would say, you're kind of exploring some ways to articulate why you're doing what you're doing. And depending on your relationship to a blank page, as far as like writing about the work you're doing, there might be kind of various ways to get going here, where maybe you're doing some pre-writing, maybe you're gathering kind of existing writing or like bits and pieces that you've accumulated over time, and you're kind of figuring out how to puzzle piece a draft together that you can kind of think about. Maybe you are having conversations with friends and colleagues and kind of close folks who are willing to kind of talk about your work with you, and you can kind of take recordings of those and transcribe that, and then you have some words to kind of be working with that way. You're working on establishing sort of a unique case for the work you do, and that goes hand in hand with your own kind of unique voice. And so what you're doing, you're kind of trying to get into a space where you're articulating what you're doing and how you're sort of doing something that maybe is different, maybe you're sort of setting yourself apart a bit. So you're kind of trying to suss out all those details. And you want to be thinking about telling someone who's not at all familiar with your work how you do it and why it matters. So some part of this is kind of putting language to the things that maybe for you are kind of second nature to how you're working. But you start putting words to it, and that articulation of the basics kind of becomes the building blocks of, further proposals and case making and that sort of thing. You'll also want to be establishing a sort of larger context for why your why matters and why it's deserving of funding in a particular kind of competitive setting. Maybe you're establishing what you're doing that no one else is doing, or that maybe few other people are doing, or how are you doing it differently? How are you maybe doing it? I would say sort of differently more than better, but just, what are you bringing to a space that is new or different? What are sort of the unique qualities you bring to the delivery of this work? It might be how you're making an impact or sort of like making a difference with the work you're doing. And that might be a little more, either for organizations or projects or things that are sort of community based as well. And generally also you'll want to be articulating why now is sort of a particularly important time for you to be asking for and receiving money. Is it some sort of a pivot point in your career? Have you done, this body of work and you're moving in a new direction? Various ways where you're like, yeah, this funding now is going to be particularly important, helps you make a compelling case. And then in addition to kind of setting yourself apart, there are also maybe ways in which you're also trying to situate yourself in the landscape of other organizations and artists and projects who are doing like similar or related work. So there may be ways in which you're kind of partnering with organizations and community members in meaningful ways. So you're both kind of setting yourself apart and also potentially kind of explaining how you're operating within the landscape. Yeah.
Eva, I have a quick question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's about this. Like, this is the point as an individual artist where I always get stuck talking about the why. And I'm always so concerned about the voice I'm using to write my why. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm always concerned. Like, I always think that I have to have like, I have to have a more professional way of, do you have any advice for individual artists about how to, like, the language I'm using in the grant?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't, and I think that's a really great question, because I don't think there has to be a particular tone that's like specific to seeking grants. There's not like a special language you need to learn, but I think it is about your being as clear as possible with what you're describing, you're being as clear as possible and kind of stating what you're doing, stating what you're planning on doing. And some of that is why it's great to kind of build in time and be able to kind of work through this process where either you are discussing it with other folks, or maybe you're drafting it and you're showing it to someone who's never seen it before. And you're just saying like, is this making sense?
Right.
You know what I mean? Because sometimes also that the nature of putting something together, you're like, this came out of my head and it makes great sense to me. And then you're like, once you show it to someone else, you're like, you
I know what I'm
weren't
saying.
inside my head with me. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I would say there's not like some other separate language, but it's really just, if anything, I would say you want to be sort of like, in some ways it's like you want to have the basics and make sure you're saying everything really clearly.
Yeah.
And then generally, which I'll also kind of, I think, get into a little more here, it's like, you're trying to tell compelling stories, use vivid language, you know what I mean? You're kind of trying to evoke something for someone. Like if you imagine a scenario where a bunch of folks are reviewing a bunch of applications, you're also kind of trying to do that thing where you're like, what's going to make it stand out with my language choice? And, you're both being clear and vivid. So I would say those kinds of things are a good way to think about it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. So then talking a little more about making your case, depending on sort of different settings, there will be a component that is a written component. You'll also have the opportunity to present a budget, sort of numbers component. Maybe you have these opportunities to put together images, stories, things like testimonials, or just kind of like community. You might have kind of letters of recommendation of some kind. So you can think about what the pieces are that are available to you, and then think about how you can kind of tell your story richly among all the pieces that are kind of at your disposal in a given situation. And if you're doing this sort of language gathering, if it's for your own work, what are the things you've written in the past? What are the sources of storytelling that are available to you? is it, and also depending on if you're working for like an organization or a project, but maybe you have things like reports or like meeting notes or any sort of planning documents, anything, just kind of round up what you may have already at your disposal to work with. If you may, this kind of pushes a little bit into organizational territory, but like if you work for an organization or a project that you're trying to help fundraise for, like who are the people that hold the information and who are the people who have that sort of vivid language and storytelling information for you. So kind of you want to help get to the folks who are kind of closest to the impact, who can help provide that meaningful language. And in your own kind of individual work, it might be kind of just talking to different people who experience your work in different ways. So you're also getting these kind of different perspectives, and you're kind of gathering and generating language that way that you can work with. Yeah, so it's like, what are the details that make your work come to life? Again, kind of looking for lively language and stories that really illustrate the work you're doing. And you'll also want often to be communicating impact in various ways. Like I think about like points of change, like was someone different after interacting with your work in some way? Are there things you're doing that nobody else is doing in quite this way? You're sort of looking for these kind of like points of change, and that helps to communicate impact. So kind of restating this idea of you're both kind of setting yourself apart. Maybe you're also showing how you're collaborating with others and working in the landscape. And I did pull some example questions. Speaking of creative capital, they provide grants of up to $50,000 to individual artists to support the creation of groundbreaking new projects. I think they award, so they receive a lot of applications. They receive thousands of applications, and they fund about 50 artists a year. They sort of alternate years in terms of like the subject matter, or like the topics, the fields in which artists are working. So I think they just came off of like visual arts and film. And then I think the next year would be, I think, probably written work of some kind. And, they just kind of alternate. But one thing that I was excited about when I was looking them up and kind of seeing where they're at is that their new application process comprises 6 questions, which they noted was reduced from 40 questions. Just wanted to say, what a time to be alive. They're, respecting people's time and cutting down to shape up their application. So I just thought that was great. So some of their questions here, I think you will come across questions in grant applications, and they're all sort of similar flavors. That's why I thought this was a great, just a place to have an example sort of set of questions. So, their questions are, and while they said that they are now doing 6 questions, some of their questions do have multiple questions embedded. So they are cheating a little bit, but they've clustered them as 6. So how does your project take an original and imaginative approach to content and form? What are the main influences upon your work as an artist? And how does your past work inform your current work? They are also asking what kind of impact, in all these various ways, artistic, intellectual, communal, civic, etc. What ways are you hoping that you'll be creating this impact? And what are the strategies you're going to use to achieve that impact? Who are the specific audiences and communities you hope to engage through the project? And how are you hoping to reach those folks? And then how might your proposed project act as a catalyst for your own artistic and professional growth? And in what ways is it a pivotal moment in your practice? They have one more question that I didn't include in the slides here, which is just, they also specifically, in addition to awarding money, they award sort of support services like consultations, gatherings, alumni network, workshops, that kind of stuff. And they ask, like, how would these non-monetary services also help you realize your goals? But generally, that's kind of a little more specific to their funding. And these questions, I think, also kind of stand, again, you'll see sort of similar flavors, with people kind of putting their own spin on it, or like how much space they will give you to actually answer those kinds of questions. Some folks want to see it short. Some folks say it as many words as you want. Also, when thinking about fundraising generally and seeking grants, I think it's valuable to kind of do a little check-in and examine your own relationship to money. if you are fundraising with something like a project or a collaborative endeavor or an organization, it really is a collaborative, fundraising is a collaborative process. I'm kind of speaking a little bit from a space where like there can be moments in some organizations where I think people expect like fundraisers go out into the wild and kind of come back with giant sacks of money. But it is really like a collaborative process, and everyone is a participant in the process. You're storytelling in all different ways, and you're trying to kind of deliver stories from the people who are the best to tell the story. And maybe it's all these kind of different facets of a program. So that's just a thing to keep in mind. Also, seeking grants, seeking money. I think it's important to just examine and kind of check in with your own feelings of scarcity or abundance. I've been working in the field of fundraising now for, I've been doing this work for around 20 years, but I didn't personally come from a moneyed background. And I realized, fairly early on that there's obviously kind of a power dynamic when you need money and you're asking for money and people have money and you're trying to access it. So, I think there are also can be kind of situations where there's some way in which maybe asking for money feels like it's somehow kind of dirty, or people who think that asking for money is kind of bad or dirty, but it's also like money is the thing we need to, support our lives and our projects. So we're all kind of participants in this process of kind of accessing the money. Like if you work at a project or you work at a nonprofit organization and you are being paid, then you are receiving that money. So I would say when you're fundraising, ideally, the folks who you're seeking funding from, your funders, your grantors, donors, ideally these folks are your enthusiastic partners and seeing your work come to fruition. And ideally, it feels less like kind of a dog and pony show where you're like parading your work in front of folks to get money, but more like you're communicating the work honestly, and they are glad to be able to help support it. Yeah. Do a little water sip. And then I wanted to talk about budgets, project budgets. I really love project budgets. I came to grant writing through the writing side of things, but then realized how much it's also a joy to do the budgeting side of things. Project budgets are a way to tell the story of your work using numbers. And it is complementary, and it should be complementary to what you're putting in writing. The budget is this opportunity to, you're showing that you've thought it through, you've planned it out. It costs X amount of dollars. It doesn't need to be down to the penny, but you're like, it costs this much money to do this work that I'm proposing. And so if you're able to kind of articulate your budget clearly, it'll also help support you in developing the narrative for your work. I will share a link a little later, and I have some information that I'll share in a moment. But there is a group called Springboard for the Arts out of Minneapolis that, among kind of doing their own programming, they also offer fiscal sponsorship service, which, to speak very briefly about fiscal sponsorship, it's basically like if you are not a nonprofit, but you have a project that you kind of want to access you want to be able to access kind of tax deductible donations. So you're sort of living under an umbrella of somebody else's 501c3 nonprofit designation. So they offer fiscal sponsorship, and they have a great budgeting 101 resource that I like in terms of just how they talk about budgeting. So I'll share that link. But generally, you're in your budget, you are putting together a picture of how money is going to help you do the project. And expenses are really kind of mapping this, the path that you're going to take to turn this project into reality. I think it's great to come up with a couple of different versions of your budget. Something that is kind of your bare bones version, which is like, I could do this work. This is the least amount of money I need to kind of do what I'm trying to do here. And kind of keep that one to yourself. And then you're also developing a sort of blue sky version that's like, here's the ideal way I would like to be doing this work. We are paying all the artists who are participating in this project, and maybe we're having a launch event, and maybe we are, maybe there's kind of a research component where we're traveling, like whatever the kind of picture of your project is, you're like, this is how I'd like to be doing it. And that is what you want. Depending on, how you're fundraising, that's the kind of thing you want to be fundraising with. Yeah. And there'll also be, you may have something that's like ultra detailed for your own use. And then the thing that you would present out to a funder would start to be something a little more kind of grouped. You kind of chunk your income and expenses, or expenses mostly. And I have some example kinds of, I hope this is like somewhat visible. This is one of the resources I drew from Springboard. And I typically you'll see an income over expense. I just put it side by side because of the nature slides. But you'll just see basically you're putting together a document where you're showing like, here are all my sources of income. You might have more or less of these types, but these are kind of the general types. You're applying for grants. Maybe you have some corporate contributions, some individuals donating, etc. And then here's, one sort of breakdown of what the kind of types of categories of expenses you might be outlining. Things like stipends, equipment, other kinds of, services, travel, marketing, etc. And I have one other version where I just kind of pulled some slightly different, expense categories. And these are kind of more like exhibition related, where it's like honorariums and artist fees for, art who are participating, maybe public programming folks who are participating. If you want to be giving them stipends, things like fabrication, installation, kind of shipping, signage, space rental, depending on what you're doing. So basically just, you're thinking about how your project will come to be and kind of figuring out some categories that describe the different ways in which you'll be spending money.
And Eva, am I right in understanding, do I want income and expenses to equal zero when I'm applying for a grant?
I think that's a great question. You will either so some funders will want you to present a budget where you are kind of like, sometimes they'll say, how are you going to spend this money you're asking for?
Right.
And sometimes you might have a bigger project and you're seeking a portion of the funds from them, and you might have kind of a bigger, snapshot.
More money than what they're like. Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
So you definitely don't want your expenses, like if I'm submitting as an individual artist a grant, I don't want my expenses to go way above and beyond the grant I'm applying for. Or are they I guess it depends on what they're.
That is also a great question, because it's something to keep in mind depending on how many different grants you're planning on applying for. Because sometimes it's like you want to be thinking about how you're presenting the work, and if one grant comes in but not all the grants, how can you still do the work? Like, right. And some, you'll often kind of have opportunities to follow up with a funder if the picture of things kind of changes, where you can say, that if you've received X amount of funds in total and you're making some changes. But I think also, as you seek, you don't want to have like a huge project budget where you're expecting to just get one grant in, which is kind of not totally realistic. Yeah.
Right. Okay, cool.
Yeah. But figuring out that balance and kind of keeping it in mind as you go. And in the world of like when you're at an organization and you're fundraising, there's kind of, I think, a general rule of thumb that's like, you might ask for like 3 times as many grants or 3 times as many dollars as you're hoping to get in, because some people are going to say no. So thinking about something that way.
I see Lisa has her hand up.
Yeah, I have a question around matching, and I don't know much about this. I know that some grants will require you to either match the funds or have somebody else match the funds. So just wondering if you have anything to share on that.
Yeah, that is a great question. Sometimes it can be that you might be matching with, I think, so those kinds of situations, I think they're essentially trying to gather information about, like, are you being supported more broadly in the work you're doing? we don't want to be the single funding source for your work here. So that might be that you're seeking other grants, or it might be that you are doing something like crowdfunding, or you're asking for individual donations. And I think it's essentially you're kind of just showing that they're not a sole funder, and that you also kind of have a base of possible support for the work.
So in that situation, would you apply for multiple grants at the same time and say you're looking to like distribute it, or would you first find a funder that is looking for a matching and then apply for another grant and frame it as a matching grant? Like, how would you approach that?
Yeah. I think that's hard. I think I would try to say that, I would try to say and make a reality the idea of kind of looking for multiple grants at the same time. And also I would say some of it is that I feel like in different grants and different funding opportunities, they might say by some certain period in the process, you will have had to match it. So it might also be like, let's say you get a grant, and then you might be able to use that as sort of like a stimulus to say, then maybe you're doing some crowdfunding, or you're asking individuals for support, or you're then, kind of looking for other grants, and you're saying this funder is on board with what I'm doing. I've got this grant and I'm seeking matching funds. I think there are kind of different ways where, it can be strong then to be kind of leveraging something that you are either looking for or something you've gotten, to then say, I've already got this kind of vote of confidence, and can you join me in kind of helping support this way? So it is a little tricky. And yeah, I think depending on specific cases, folks will kind of articulate where in the process you need to have matched, or sometimes they'll even say like what kinds of sources they want to see matching funds from. So I hope that's helpful. Cool. And then I want to talk a little bit about figuring out how much to actually ask. Sometimes as you're seeking funding, funders will just tell you the dollar amount range of grants they expect to be funding. And you can also, depending on the funder, if it's coming from something like a foundation or any sort of group like that, you can look at so either in their own website, they may have shared like the dollar amounts that they're giving out. You can also look at their 990s, which is a publicly available tax document. And I'll take us through like a little bit of a quick scan. This is also the kind of thing where like tools like Foundation Center and that thing called Instrumental offer access. They're doing some of the like aggregating and reviewing of that kind of information for you, but it's also publicly available information. So you can, if you figure out how to kind of scan these documents quickly, then you can gather a fair amount of information, and it's pretty easy. But so what you can learn from a 990 is like the total dollar amount that a foundation or a funder might be granting, what kind of size of grants are they giving out, if they haven't otherwise kind of specified this information. And depending, if you kind of get into a space where you come across a funder that you've heard of and they don't have much of a website, their 990 will also potentially share a little bit of information about what their application process is. Generally, you want to be asking for what you need in the context of the budget, your budget, as well as in the context for how they're funding, which is partly to say like you don't gain points for kind of going in and asking for like a small amount if that's not realistic to the project you're trying to fund. And also again, kind of tuning into how and what they're funding. Are they actually offering opportunity to fund like a chunk of your project, or do they say we're comfortable funding a whole project? Or do they say, if it's kind of organizationally based, maybe they're available to offer funding for kind of a significant amount of your actual operating cost, versus like folks who say we're giving out kind of smaller amounts of money that are kind of tied to specific projects. So you just kind of want to be tuning into what they're saying, what you actually need in your budget, in terms of like determining ask them out there. I see a hand was raised.
Yeah, Bryce, what's up?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, right on. Yeah, no, just in regards to this, so I guess my question is, um, often when I was looking to get funded through grants and stuff like that, a lot of times they're offering like some mega cheddar cheese. And so kind of in relation to this, perhaps like because I know you mentioned, obviously multiple streams is usually a good thing. Certainly the grant that I was looking at was like maybe for like 25 G's.
Nice.
And so I was like, oh snap. I was like, this is like an operational budget. I should really, get on this. But then I realized, I was like, well, then they would be like my only funder, because if they're going to give me 25 grand, and and I don't need anything else. But so would you recommend in that regard, because obviously, with the multiple streams and things, kind of seeing if they usually just do like the 25 grand and then be like, okay, well, maybe I need to, think smaller, because I don't really need 25, G's to do what I want to do? Or what would you suggest in that regard? And I guess specifically what I'm asking is, for example, here in Ontario, we have the city of Toronto has like its own grants. Ontario has its own grants, and then Canada as a nation has its own grants. They're all the federal government provides for, of course, Canada, and then it doles it out to Ontario, and then Ontario doles it out to Toronto. But yeah, so it's just to say that I was like, oh, well, yeah, I'll do Toronto. But then like Toronto was like, saying, well, we'll give you 25 cheese. And I was like,
Yeah.
snap.
Yeah. Well, so one thing I would say is that, again, you can kind of explore the language they're providing in terms of, they might say, we're comfortable funding your whole project versus we want to see that you have other kinds of funding sources. But then also I would say, perhaps it's an opportunity to kind of explore the way you're putting together your project budget and thinking about the reality of what you're trying to fund. Like, thinking about how people, yourself, or like if you have collaborators, like how much people are getting paid, and sort of what the space is of like, thinking about how much, again, kind of that blue sky version versus like, if you're in the kind of bare bones mentality of like what you need to make a thing work versus like what is the picture that you want to see in the universe of like how people are being paid for creative work. Maybe it's actually like that grant is a perfect amount to kind of fund payment for yourself and other people in the process. I think it's worth just kind of looking. I don't have a lot of detail here as far as like how one might go about benchmarking, but you might like see what are kind of stipends for creative work happening in the spaces in your community, and maybe it's kind of asking around. But I think some of it is also like, it's not that you are like hoping to become a millionaire from grants, but like what is a space where you're like, actually that is how creative work should be valued, figuring out how money appears in your project budget that way. So it's kind of a little bit both ways. Understanding if they want to see different sources and thinking about how you might put that together, but also thinking maybe you do want that amount of money and maybe that's a great amount. Does that feel like that answers your question? I hope so.
I think so.
But okay, cool. I can say more again, also further.
Oh, no, thank you so much.
Yeah. So I'm going to do just like a quick dive. We're not going to spend a lot of time on 990s, but what I usually do is I search the internet. You can access them. So I just say like, I'm using the Andy Warhol Foundation here. I search the internet for their 990. Typically the first thing that pops up is ProPublica. You click right into it. There's a little more you'll see on the page, but basically you're looking for their tax filings. You'll click that little button that says view filing. It's a very long document, but generally the things that are helpful if you're like skimming, early in the document, there's this place where you see how much money they have, their sort of revenue and expenses. So here, the sort of numbers at the bottom are their total revenues for the year. And then I apologize because in the next one, I will have cut off the columns on top, but So like this, what's going to be the bottom right column is the amount of money they're dispersing for charitable purposes. So you see that this foundation, the Warhol Foundation, is giving out $19 million. And then if you scan a little further down, the Warhol Foundation has its own kind of robust application website. But also you'll see this section of the 990 where it has this information about how a person or an organization would apply. So if a funder has not had like a lot of detailed information on a website themselves, they'll sometimes just say like, send a letter to this address, or send a letter to this email. So there's this part of the 990 that you can kind of visually look for this chunk of information and then see if there's anything there of use to you. And then as you scan further down on a 990, you will see the grants that they're making. And there's a much longer list, but it looks like this. There's a part where it specifies the organization, specifies what the grants are for and how much they're granting. And again, there are tools that can kind of synthesize this information for you, but also just generally you can scan and see like, okay, most of the grants are for X amount, or, you can start to see the range, and that helps give you information about what you might ask. Oh, the other thing I just wanted to say about 990s is that it also shows who are like the highest paid individuals. I think maybe over 100K at an organization, which is always just fun to be like, who's the highest, what are people making? I like to, it's like monetary transparency in these publicly available documents. So it's your place to, and I don't have a screenshot there, but actually there might've been some early information, but basically you can see what folks are getting paid at the high levels at an institution, which is handy to learn. Great. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about deadlines. I think in addition to figuring out how to turn my English major into gainful employment, I think also that the act of having deadlines personally puts shape to my time. I feel like I would just be like an ooze without deadlines, and I don't think I would get anything done. Generally, grant seeking, there are kind of seasons, kind of like spring and fall deadlines, clustered, but not always. But, sometimes that means in the winter and the summer you're preparing. But generally, there are things going on all the time, but spring and fall are sometimes where things kind of peak and cluster. When you're looking at any sort of funder, you might check out whether they have sort of firm deadlines, like they specify dates, or whether they have kind of a rolling deadline. Like, is it something where they're reviewing proposals all the time and you can send it anytime you want? Do they have an annual deadline? Do they have something twice a year? Do they have something quarterly? Is it a process where maybe you send a letter of inquiry, which is an LOI? Do you send that first, and then later, after they've seen that, if they want, they'll ask you for more information in a full proposal? Or is the letter going to be kind of your one chance to kind of get all your information out there in front of them? And just generally, as you start to identify potential grants and funding opportunities, survey what they are asking for and see if they have pieces that are going to require kind of a longer lead time to put together, just as you're assessing, like, here comes a deadline, can I meet that deadline? Whatever the kind of space there, that you'll kind of get to know what is the amount of time you need to put together a proposal. And maybe you're kind of developing, depending on how you like to work, maybe you have something like a grants calendar in your GCal, maybe you have a spreadsheet, maybe you have a little bit of both, maybe you're using project management software, whatever kind of works for you. I do feel like there's sort of a law of physics where you will find an opportunity and you're like, this is perfect, and it's due in 7 minutes, or, it's due tomorrow, it's due next week. But you can kind of get a feel for, just like what is possible for you. And ideally, you're also getting a sense like, is this deadline going to come around again? Do I really need to crunch now? Versus like, is it coming up in another quarter and I can hit that deadline? So, kind of keep those things in mind as you're seeing things, seeing deadlines, seeing how it fits into your life. Again, thinking about, you're kind of going to want to be baking. Ideally, you're sort of baking in some time to work on something over time. But then also you'll have materials at the ready where if you see something come up quickly, maybe you're kind of more ready to go for the next one. So, I also wanted to talk a little bit about being a procrastinator. Over the years, I have I become a little bit better about procrastinating. And one thing that I love to do is sneak up on working, which I love to create a working document for things where I just, as soon as I see something that is of interest, just make a document where you drop in, like cut and paste all the questions they're asking. And it's sort of like you're not actually doing any work yet, but you have actually done some work because you're starting to get the wheels turning. You've got it in a document. And then, you can pull up that document anytime you want, start dropping in ideas. And also it gives you a place where like, you can, if you're going to be collaborating with folks, you can start to say like, actually join me in this document and we can think about this together. So I feel like that is just, as soon as you kind of get into that space, you're setting yourself up well to kind of be working on the process. And just also kind of getting over the sense that you need to kind of be writing the good sentences coming out of your fingers like as you go, more like feel comfortable to just like brain dump, get it out on the page. Working with something on the page can often be easier than trying to kind of craft it in your brain and have it come out like sparkling diamonds from your fingertips. So if you get over that, you'll also be doing well. Again, as far as language and writing development, are you the person who's coming up with this language? Is there someone else you can identify who's helping you to put together these words? Yeah, and most generally, I would just say the nature of sort of grant seeking is that there are enough kind of moving parts, even just between like narrative and budget, where if you save it till the end, you might find just the kind of moving between those spaces gets complicated and it can get kind of overwhelming. So you want to give yourself time to work on all those pieces. Then I will also say the thinking about, as you're identifying these opportunities, thinking about their actual application process. Is it something like a fillable portal? Basically, you want to get familiar with how you're going to apply for the thing as soon as possible, because otherwise it will find some way to sneak up on you, I promise, at whatever deadline it is. So is it going to be like a portal with fillable fields? Is it something where you just go somewhere and you like attach a letter? Is it, some mix of that kind of process? I have interacted with enough portals to know that sometimes just like funky things happen. And something will happen if you're like, I'm just close to the deadline and I'm just meeting it. You're going to hit some sort of funky business with kind of character counts or word counts, or maybe attachment sizes. You thought you had something that would work and it's too large. Sometimes you will get into a portal and like you answer a question a certain way and it sort of unlocks other questions that you didn't know were buried in there. So basically start interacting with whatever the process looks like and get your head around kind of the questions they're asking and how they're asking them. But you've got your working document, you're interacting with the portal. I like to think about writing long. And so you have, write as much as you want, brain dump kind of all this information, gather all the language you want, and then, save that and then start working on kind of answering specific questions, because different formats are going to ask you for kind of different word counts or maybe character counts. So rather than trying to like write up to a small word or character count, I feel like it's handy to just write long and then give yourself some time to digest that and kind of copy and paste what you need and kind of work from there. And put together the puzzle that way. And there is sort of an art to editing something, thinking about editing something long down to a short blurb, like you're trying to say everything you need to say in as few words as possible, and just leaving yourself time for that process as well. Because like sometimes you'll come up against something where you're like, I just need to cut a few words. And other times you're like, I wrote 4 pages and I need to submit 1. So you can kind of think about the level where you're operating in terms of how much you need to cut, or like how much you are trying to fit into kind of a certain container. Yeah, generally, if you have collaborators and there are things you're kind of promising in your grant, just making sure everyone is on board with what's getting submitted in the grant. And if there are kind of different people involved in the process who are going to be accountable to different pieces, you want everyone to just be aware of what is going out in a grant and is being kind of promised. Great. So then I will talk briefly about attachments, which is also like just this kind of can be kind of great supplementary pieces that you're, you have your narrative, you have your budget. Maybe they're going to ask for things like a timeline, like in addition to how you're going to spend money on your project, like how will it unfold over the next year or two? Maybe they're, they are likely asking for work samples of some kind. So maybe you're putting together, versions of the things you've written, or photographs of an installation of your work somewhere, or recordings of music you've created. Think about how you're kind of surveying your work over a period of time and how you're putting together those pieces to share. Again, maybe there's kind of press related coverage. There is an opportunity to share, there could be an opportunity to share kind of bios and resumes, where you are like, make sure you're just kind of thinking about all the different ways in which you have language at your disposal. So let's say you have kind of a limited word count in your narrative, but you also are supplying a separate attachment of bios. You don't need to duplicate language. If you have sort of like these spaces where you are operating to kind of assemble information, you're like, okay, I'm going to cover this here. I've got my bio. I don't need to duplicate. So I can say these other things that I want to make sure I'm saying. So just collectively, you're kind of using all the pieces at your disposal to put together the strongest possible case. And also we'll just generally say, you don't want to be over promising anything. You're not trying to pitch something big just to get a grant, unless that's actually kind of the project you're putting out there. If you can put something ambitious out there, if that's what you are planning and hoping to do. Your goal is to tell the story of your work as deeply and meaningfully as possible. And, for both individuals and organizations and projects, like, your request for funding is rooted in the fact that you are able to deliver on the thing that you're saying you're going to do. So, typically you're showing some evidence that you've done something like this, and you're saying, now I'm going to go into this, here's what's next for me. I've done this, here's what's coming next. It's a little less like, I would love to do this thing that I've never done before, but if I had money, I would do it. It's a little more like, here are the things I'm doing to build up to this moment where money is going to really help me kind of move into this next space and kind of level up a little bit. And
Bryce.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, just related to this, actually. So, in regards to, so it sounds like, that this is saying, obviously building off of what you've previously done. So I get the feeling that sometimes with grants, certainly the grant that I was mentioning before, obviously with a large dollar amount, led me to believe that I would have had to have been doing stuff previously, and kind of maybe pursuant to your last slide, just about supporting material. Is this something that you would recommend, each time you do a project or each time you do something, make sure that you are, documenting or have, things, because in regards to material that's extra, I was like, well, snap, now I have to write bios.
Yeah.
Right? Now I have to, prepare all this stuff. Would that be something that you would recommend, whilst you're doing it, to kind of, have a back catalog of these things? Or I guess what would be the best way to do that so that when the time is right for you to ask for the money, you can say oh well, yeah, I have these things
yeah,
right here.
I love that question, and that's perfect, because great question, great answer. Yes, it's great to be kind of documenting. I think there may be ways in which you will find oh yeah, I have been doing those things. And it is, once you start to put words to it, or you take photographs at something that happened, or you have documentation of the things that happened, or you have testimonials from people who were there and something happened. You know what I mean? I think exactly, yes, documenting, you're putting, I feel like there's a lot of ways in which putting language to and kind of documenting any sort of experience formalizes it. You know what I mean? You start to kind of put a shape to it where you're like, oh yeah, I did that thing. So I think definitely thinking about it while you're in it is the perfect time to do it. And then also you can look back and like if there were people who were participating in things with you, you can kind of after the fact, put together their bios if there's someone who you're going to be collaborating with further. But yes, documentation as you go, that puts body to things that might sometimes maybe seem ephemeral, but gives it some shape. So I think that's great. Yeah. Cool. So you got a grant. What happens next? You can say thanks for your grant. Yay. You can say congratulations to yourself. Pat, give yourself a pat, give your collaborators a pat. Say thank you. Sometimes you're just sending someone a letter or an email, work with the information that they're providing so you kind of know how to communicate with them. They will share some sort of information with you by which you can understand what kinds of things you're now responsible for in terms of like, do you have to communicate that you got this grant? Do you have a timeline on which you're supposed to be reporting back on this grant? Are there multiple reporting timelines, or is it just kind of at the end of the grant? And also you'll then want to be, if you've sort of promised that you would do something, or you've said like, I'm going to make this kind of impact, then at the end of the grant, you will be responsible for saying like, I did that. So you kind of want to figure out ways to kind of track and gather that information. Maybe you're having some sort of event where a certain number of people came and you're kind of tracking that, or, just different ways of showing that you did the thing you said you would be doing. And if you're working with like a broader number of folks or collaborators, think through who's going to be responsible for multiple kinds of information gathering, or if it's just you and you're thinking about kind of how to put that process into play. If you didn't get it this time, also fine. Success can be defined in multiple ways. Obviously, one way is, did you get the grant, which is exciting and great if you do. I also think it's important to just recognize that the thinking and work that you've put into a grant is going to serve you in some other ways, whether it's future grants or maybe you're advancing your work in some way. Like, did you start a conversation you'd been meaning to start? Did you kickstart a collaboration? Did you start to actually kind of articulate the money you actually need to get something done? Whereas before you'd kind of been thinking about it inside your head. Maybe you're starting to dig in on like how to actually represent that this work is kind of reaching people and is impacting folks in some way. Or maybe in the process of getting ready for a grant, you did kind of figure out taking some great photographs, like having someone come and document your presentation or whatever it might be. Or do you have some testimonials? Like, you'll start kind of assembling information that you can roll forward into future opportunities, or just more broadly into like communications in your life. If you're trying to share about creative work you're doing, you have kind of more tools at your disposal to share in that way. So maybe you get the grant, maybe you don't get it this time, but if you're kind of engaged in this process in kind of an honest way and you're paying attention to what comes out of it, then I think you're moving forward in whatever it is you're doing. So yeah, I will, obviously I will be hoping that everyone gets one and gets more eventually, but you won't get every grant, but don't be let down by that. And then I have a bunch of slides that just have links, which I'll just run through quickly so they're there. A link to the Artist Communities Alliance with residency deadlines, a link to Creative Capital with, I think I just linked their sort of like Artist Opportunities newsletter. Poets and Writers has a grants and awards database for poets and writers. Philanthropy News Digest was that thing about requests for proposals. Hyperallergic newsletter. Printed Matter, if you're doing things in the realm of sort of like artist books and publishing, they've got a sort of list of artist opportunities there. You want to do some investigating about whatever is happening in your state or your region. And I also just wanted to shout out, I don't think there's anyone here necessarily from the Minneapolis kind of Twin Cities area, but I love the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council. I love you, MRAC. I just think they're doing a great job of being sensitive to the process of applying, and I think they're listening to feedback, and I think they're working on funding groups that may have historically have had a harder time accessing funds. So I just love them and think they're great. Included the Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. Creative Independent, I hope folks know about this, or I want you to know about it. There's just a lot of interviews, and also they've put together all kinds of fun guides, which are handy. So that's just a fun thing to tune into. Not necessarily grants, but like lots of information that you might like to use as a creative person. I mentioned those eFlux emails if you want to get all kinds of emails and skim them. Foundation Center, Instrumental, Springboard I mentioned earlier with these budgeting 101 tips. They have a page where they just go into a little more detail and kind of thinking also about that, the sort of like bare bones version of your budget and something that's a little more like blue sky version. And I like the way they talk about things. I also just listed a few more NEA creative writing fellowships. I did a little bit of Chicago digging. And maybe y'all from Chicago are familiar with some of these opportunities already, but there is the Chicago Individual Artist Program. And then also I just randomly came across something called the Cliff Dwellers Arts Foundation, which I think are kind of like 1 to 2K grants, but just, you know, just once you start kind of poking around, you'll see that there's things all around, all different kinds of opportunities out there waiting for you. And with that, that concludes the presentation, my presentation. Thanks, everyone. Thank you again so much to the midwives. Thanks for everyone for joining.
Yes, Eva,
yeah.
feel free to unmute and give Eva a round of applause, y'all. Yes. Thank you. That was incredible and way more.
Oh, great.
I mean, I know Alexandria asked for the links, but
Sure.
will. I can send the slides out after the fact.
Yeah.
If you okay, great. So everyone, don't worry. We'll get
Yeah.
the slides. I'll send them out. It'll probably be tomorrow. So Eva, you don't have to do anything but
Okay.
figure out a way to share them with me, and then I'll send them out. I see a hand, Lisa.
Hi. So my question is around the proving you could do it piece, and it seems like that, you know, what I hear from the grapevine is the best predictor of whether or not you're going to get the grant is whether or not you've had grants in the past. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts for people who are new to grants, who like kind of first time grants, and also how you could maybe, I'm all for like creatively reframing things as maybe like how you can use things that aren't getting grants and framing them in a way that would be grant useful.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe, I suppose one thing I might recommend is I do think there are funders out there who are looking to be sort of like a first time funder of projects. And so it might be like you're trying to get over that threshold from like not having received any grants to now receiving some. And, you know, whether they're giant or not giant, like I think there are funders out there who want to be helping you get that first sort of access to funding that then helps you say you've gotten it before. So some of it might even just be like searching around for like first time. I don't, you know, playing around with some of the language of searching, if it's like first time grants for X, or like it might be sort of emerging, using the word kind of like emerging artist, or thinking about it that way, which at least helps show that you have some of that support kind of available there. Yeah, and as far as the reframing kind of thing, I mean, if you're able to show some form of like support, if, you know, I don't know, it could vary, like if there were something where you were like selling tickets for something and you were like, we had income from this source. I'm not sure if that totally gets at it, but I think the best thing I would recommend is that sort of like first trying to find the things that are kind of helping folks break into the space of receiving funding, which then you're trying to leverage for other opportunities. But it's like there has to be a first one all the time. So yeah, some of it is just keeping eyes peeled for, I do think there are, and I've seen kind of opportunities out there that are designed for emerging artists or emerging projects. Yeah, I think that's the best I can offer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's weird. It's weird to have to try to say we've had money and thus are now eligible to get more money. But yeah, there are folks helping. I think there are funders in there kind of helping get into that initial space.
And Eva, before everybody goes, I want to plug that you might be doing on your own this kind of work in the future.
Oh yeah.
So, this is like a practical skills. We asked Eva because she happens to have this skill, but she might be going forth and doing this kind of work in the future. So you should keep an eye on her.
Thanks. Yes, those are good. Yeah, and also generally, like this is a big picture overview, but also, digging in further on kind of different facets of the process, or you all can stay tuned, but like just versions of like, if you're working on a proposal and you would like another set of eyes on it, like that kind of thing. I want to be kind of making myself a little more available for those kinds of things. Kind of like consulting on the specific, or kind of helping dig in on specific opportunities. So
I don't want to keep you over because it is 8:33, but what I can say, if anybody has questions, feel free to email me at info@, and if Eva's available to answer it, we'll figure it out. But definitely feel free to email the midwives. We have one more workshop in October about healthcare coming up at the end of October, so keep an eye on the website. If anybody else, I'm not going to end the Zoom call, but I just want to say, we are done, and thank you so much for coming. It was nice to see you all.
Yes, thanks everyone.